Hello and welcome to the Maya Hair Training Kit. In this series of tutorials, I want to give you an overview of how to use Maya's hair and dynamic curve system. The first part of the lessons will be just an overview of how the menus work, how the actual hair works, and all the components that make up the hair system. From there, we'll actually jump into some real-world examples and how you can use hair in your own productions. Okay, let's start off by first jumping into the Dynamics menu, and you have a hair menu option here. We'll just tear that off, set it over here, and you notice when you click Create Hair, you're going to get an error. To make hair, you have to actually have an object, so let me add a sphere to my shelf. And we're going to use just a generic sphere for a lot of our experiments today, just to see what we can make with this. Alright, let's open up the option box. Let's take a look at some of these settings here. I'll just reset. Alright, by default, you get to paint with Paint Effects. Now you have three choices. You can do either Paint Effects, NURBS Curves, or both. Let me show you what Paint Effects look like. We'll just hit Create Hairs. And if I hit 5 to shade, you can see how these are shaded hairs. Okay, let me actually render this. Show you what this looks like rendered. Okay, so these are the individual hairs that are they're curves with Paint Effects strokes put on them. Alright, let me undo. And this time we'll choose Curves. NURBS Curves. Now, in this instance, we have these curves, but when we render, we get nothing. So why would you need the two? Well, the NURBS Curves could be used then to make surfaces. So if you wanted to, you could, let's just see if we can line some up here. We'll take this one, this one, this one. So we'll take these curves here that are all lined up, alright, and then we'll loft between them. So let me just jump out here to Surfaces, Loft, and you can see here we've now made a surface. Let me jump out of here. So if you want to, we can hit Rewind and play. And you can see now how that surface is reacting because of the curves that are dynamic. Okay, let me undo this. A couple steps here. Alright. And if you were to choose both, you would get both results. So you would have curves that you could loft as well as Paint Effects curves. Okay. Now, you have a V and a U count, there here, U and V, that are 8 and 8. So if I set this to 1 and 1, it's going to make one hair for me. Let me just turn off my grid. Okay, and if I play this back, you can see how this reacts. Just like so. Now, I'm going to make another sphere. I'm going to move it up. And on this one, I'm going to make some changes. So, points per hair, the default is 10. Now, the longer your hair, the higher this number needs to be, because it's going to give a much more accurate result. Now, remember, the higher this number, also the higher the render time. So just keep that in mind. Let me show you the difference. Okay, both of these have the exact same length. They're just, this has 4 times as many points. And you can see how it reacts much differently. Okay, just take that off. So we'll set this back down to 10. Now, passive fill, what that means, you actually have passive curves with that throughout the system. What that means is for every active hair that we create, we can create so many passive curves in between the active ones. Now, the active ones will be the ones that will deform. The passive ones will be the ones that will actually, they will follow the same rotation and same deformation as the active curves. So think of it like this. You have 4 curves that are active, and you have 4 curves that are passive. The passives will act just like instances of the deformed curves. So you get twice as much stuff for the same amount of computational power. So let's just set this to 4 and 4. Okay, no passive curves. Let's apply, just see what we get here. Okay, so we get kind of like a star type effect. Undo, and let me increase my passive fill to 2. Okay, so what that means is it's placed 2 passive curves, and you can see them, these little blue dots, or blue follicles. These blue follicles are, there's 2 between every active curve. Okay, so that's how you read that out. Now the length, that's how long the hairs are. So let me just drop these back down to 1 and 1 so you can see. And you can just see how long that hair is. You undo that off. So that's your length. Let me set that back to default. And let me talk to you about randomization real fast. Randomization, let me just put this to our default 8 and 8 and show you what happens. Okay, so these are evenly spread out all over the place. If I was to turn up some randomization, let's say to 1, which is all randomization, watch what happens. See how I have clumps up here? I have a clump. I have some bald spots. So it'll actually go through and randomize the placement of all of those little follicles. Those little red dots. Okay. Then you also have create rest curves, which I'm not going to talk about now. I'll show you later on how to create your rest curves. But these are the curves that would be generated when the system is at rest. Right, so we'll hit create curve. Actually, let me undo that and just set this back down to 1 and 1. So it's just a little bit easier to see. Okay. So when I run that simulation, there's actually a rest curve on here. If I go to display rest position, there it is. Alright. And we're going to talk about all this here in just a second. Get more into it. The last few options that I want to talk about are edge bounded and equalize. Now, edge bound is going to be really important when we're using polygon surfaces. So let me close this. I'll just make a new file. And let me make a polygon surface. I'll just choose cylinder. And while I have that selected, I'll just go to cylindrical map. And you can see that I only have half of my surface mapped. Okay? So what it's going to do is it's going to look at the UV information when I add hair to this. So we'll add, let's say, 5 and 5. And I want to choose this edge bound. Okay, watch what happens. Notice that the UV projection, or the cylindrical projection, is really what's driving the placement of these hairs. And if you want, you can actually go into the attribute editor. Let me just close that for a second. And you can see here I'm adjusting the projection sweep, and then it is then driving the placement of the hairs. So that's a great little attribute there that is kind of hidden away. Let me just put this back on. Okay, that's edge bound. The last one is equalize. And by default, it's going to equalize regardless. Let me turn this off, hit apply, and let me show you what you get. Okay, pretty standard. I'll turn on equalize. You're going to get pretty much the same thing. Where it makes a difference is where you have randomization on or off. So let me turn up randomization and apply. And you'll see we have some bald spots here, like this big gap. Now let me turn it on. And you see it's going to try to spread out as much as possible. There'll still be some randomization, like you can see here. But it's trying to spread out over the whole sphere and not just clump in one area. So that's the menu options for create hair. There's a lot in here, and it's really the best way to get started. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to use the paint hair tool. Artisan tool or the standard paint effects brush, but what's different is you have a brand new window that has all the settings for hair, and how to modify that hair built right in. Okay, so we'll go ahead and we'll take this sphere here, just frame this up, and I'll jump down and I'll create the Paint Hair Tool option box, and this is going to open up the tool settings right here. So this is your standard brush settings, your size and your opacity and whatnot. But this window is totally new, and what's happening is most of this is grayed out because we don't have any hair on here. So really the only option available to you right now is to create new hair. And now you can choose, do you want to make curves or paint effects, and then the density in the U and the V of how many you want to create. This is the points per hair, just like what I showed you earlier, and then this is your standard length. So we'll just set this to 4. Okay, so let's come over here and paint on this surface. Go. So there's our 2 and 2. Now if I was to increase this to 5 and 5, I would then be able to create a lot more follicles. Alright. So there's my hair system now. Now the minute that you start painting hair on here, you can change this now from create follicles to create passive follicles. There's one little blue one. Let me increase this density. And there you can see I'm adding all these passive follicles. And I'll just paint those wherever I want. Okay. I can delete follicles. So let's say we want a bald spot at the top of the head here. I can just paint that out. Just like that. I can edit the follicle attributes. Now when I activate this, notice the second line became active. And here you can actually dial in any of these things, right? Maybe something like clump width, right? And then you have this number here that you can dial in. So if I set this value to 0, you can see how my clumps gone down to 0. If I crank this up to maybe something like 10, I'm sorry, 1, that's my multiplier, so I can just go in here and feed that right in. Like so. So that's the edit follicle attributes, and you can adjust any of these things. Like if you want to adjust stiffness, let's say. Let's play this back. Okay. So now let me go in here and paint some stiffness on these. So let me set it down to 0 and we'll paint these right on. You can see how things are reacting a little bit differently. Okay, so you have the edit follicle attributes. Next you have the trim hairs, which will allow you to repaint these hairs onto your different sides. So I'm just trimming these down. And then you also have the extend hairs, which will allow you to lengthen them back out. So really useful. And it just allows you to paint interactively. Now, what is different that you have here is you can create a brand new system anytime you want to add more hairs. So now you notice this has 2 hair systems. Hair system 1 and 2. And then each one can be dialed in differently and have different attributes. So maybe the top of his hair is like a spiky, hair, and the back is like a mullet, so it just flops down and the top part spikes up. We could easily make that. Just remember that this value is what's used as your multiplier. So if you set it to 0, it's going to act like 0. If it's set to 1, it would be whatever the default tool at 1 would be. So there's our hair. We'll just play this back. And you can see it's reacting and acting like it should. Alright. in the next lesson I'm going to show you the scale tool and then start to explore what some of these icons are and what your hair system is made up of. As a group, and it's called the scale hair tool, so it's very appropriately named, but I'm also going to use this lesson to give you an opportunity to explore what the actual hair system is made up of. Okay, I've got just a sphere with hair here, and I want to actually start to investigate what all is on this sphere. So let's open up the outliner. Let's take a look. So here, first off, is the sphere. And if you look, on the sphere are these little red dots. See those little red dots right there? Those are hair follicles. And you're saying, well, I got a lot more hairs here than I have dots. Well, actually what's happening is right through the center of this clump of hair is one curve that's assigned to this follicle. And then from there we have multiple curves that are added, and those are just they're free to render. You only have to render one curve, but you get all those for free, in that they will help add thickness to the clump of hair. Okay, you can access each of those by going to this hair follicles, and you can see as I click through here, let me find that, there it is. So that's the one that we're looking at. There's this one. And we can edit their properties individually. And that's the curve that's associated to that follicle. Okay, next you have a hair system. And let me go to wireframe. You'll see it's this little icon right in here. And as I play it, it will fall and droop and act, you know, the way it should. And that is the actual system icon. So if I open up my attribute editor, you'll notice that the hair system will load up. And this is where we can do things like change the dynamics. Maybe we want to increase gravity. So let's play this back and see what this looks like. Okay, that's how it reacts with a gravity of 1. Let me crank that gravity up. Now watch what happens. Okay, see how the difference is? Well, all that is gathered up inside of this system. Now we're gonna, once I finish the menus, I'm gonna come back, I'm gonna cover all of these attributes, because there's lots and lots of these attributes, to show you what these do and how they can help you with creating your pieces. So that's the hair system. Next you have the actual Paint Effects brush itself. So with that Paint Effects shape you can go in and adjust different display orders and things like that, and put your own brushes if you want. Now what's different about this setup is if you have curves created, right, so let me just make a fresh scene, and I'm going to make this as NURBS curves. Okay, same setup but NURBS curves. I want you to see one thing is going to be different. You're not going to have the Paint Effects node, right? Instead you're going to have the group of curves. So here's all the curves that make up this hair system. Okay, and you can select them as a group or you can select them individually. That's really the major change between the two. Now let's say we had these curves and we want to scale them. Well, the easiest way to do that is to come up to Hair, Scale Hair Tool. And then anywhere in your scene, you just click and drag and you can rescale. Now why should you use this tool? Well, what it's going to do is redistribute and recalculate that length so it acts appropriately. See how that acts? Let me make them bigger. Okay. So it has to adjust how this curve acts and reacts because it's shorter or longer. And the only way to get that calculation is to use this scale tool. So it's just a very handy way of going in there and selecting a handful of curves and scaling them down. So you can see here I'm just going through and highlighting a group and scaling, and when I play these back they're going to play back like they should. Alright. And that's how you use the scale tool. and the anatomy of a hair system. When you're working within the hair system, you're working and you're probably viewing the dynamic curves or the current position. You can't mess with those. Those are not to be edited and modified. Instead, you can modify the start curves or you can modify the rest curves. Let's start exploring what some of these do. Alright, so I have just a standard sphere with PaintFX hair on here. And let me pull down my display menu option here. Okay, and I'm going to hit play. Just let it play for a few frames. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and stop it. Okay, so here's our system at frame 160. And let's say I want to take a look at the start position. Where did these curves start from? I can hit start position, and there we go. Now this, what I'm looking at, is the actual system that starts the curves off. Well, why would I want to use this? Well, let's take a look and maybe right-click on one of these curves and maybe rotate this. Now, watch what happens when I go back to current position. Watch what happens when I rewind. Notice this one has a bend in it. Okay. And that's because I modified the start position of that curve. So this is how you can keep your curves in a hairstyle format to start off. Now, this system does not have rest position. So it tells you there is no unfortunate rest position. So we'll look at that in a second. We can look at both the current and the start. So this will help you kind of get an idea of where you're at. So maybe you want to modify one of these curves. And I'll show you some curve tools here in just a second. So we can modify things like that. We can look at the current and rest. We don't have a rest curve yet, so that doesn't work. And then you can look at all the curves if you want to look at them. Just remember, you can't go in and edit the current position because that position was made into this shape because of the simulator and the solver. So how do I get it to start like this? When I hit rewind, notice it goes like this. If we hit play, stop, that's where I want to start, this shape. Well, what you need to do is go to hair, set start position, and you can say from the current frame. Now watch what happens. When I rewind, that's where I start. When I hit play, the simulation goes on from here. Now at any time you can look at the start position. There it is. The current. So what is the rest position and what does that mean? Well, let's make a rest position. We'll go up here to our hair, set rest position from start. And we'll play this back. Okay. Now, doesn't look like much changed. But take a look. Actually, I just had one curve selected. Let me go back. Let me select all of our curves here. There's all of our curves. We'll go to hair, set rest position from current. There we go. There we go. Now, it acted real floppy. Well, let's take a look here. Here's our start. Here's our rest. But there's our current. Why? Well, it's because of the stiffness of these hairs. So let's open up the attribute editor real quick. And on our hair system, let's go to dynamics. And now as I crank up stiffness, it's going to try to hold that shape. Now, you will get a little bit of noise, so let's just crank this down a little bit. There we go. So that was in the dynamics section of the hair system. So now let's look at the start, the rest and current, and you notice that it's really holding the shape. Well, what's really neat about this, and watch what happens, I'm going to hit play, solvers, interactive playback. What this is going to do is allow me to move my object around, and watch what happens when I let go. It tries to get back into that shape. Okay. See how it's not just flopping straight down? And now there is some undulation. That undulation we can stop by going into our Paint Affair, your hair systems setting, and down below there's a dampening. We'll increase that dampening a little bit. See how that kind of slowed that down? And I'm going to go back over each of these attributes here in just a little bit. Well, let's move this around. So here. And there it is. So it's going back into the rest position. So there's the rest. There's current. You can see it's holding that shape. And that's how you can use rest positions. Now, you have two different ways of making them. You can make them from the start set of curves or from the current set of curves. So let me show you what would be the difference. Let me go back to my rest position. I can go in and modify each of these curves. Now this is not the way to do it, so this is a bad example. I'm stretching out the curves here, and that's not good. But there you can see it jumped into that shape right there. And here in a little bit I'll show you how to actually convert your selections into different selections. In the next lesson I'll show you how to modify some of these curves, these guys right here, to make some different looking shapes and just to make things a little bit easier when trying to edit this into a haircut. Of start curves, rest curves, and then the current curves is what you're seeing from the simulation. To make your hairstyles a little more controllable, they've taken the edit curve tools and the modify curve tools from the modeling menu and dumped them right into this system so you have them available at your fingertips. Let me show you what we're doing here. Alright. I'm going to reduce the number of hairs down to just 3 and 3, so it's a little more manageable and a little bit easier to see. And let's go up here and I'm going to tear off my display options. So we'll just say, let's look at our start position. Alright, we'll take this curve right here. Let's say we want to give it a little bit of a bend. Well, under your hair you have the modify curves, and these are taken directly from the modeling menu set. So those are all right there. Now you have a couple of cool things here. First of all, lock length and unlock length. Those are two really good attributes or settings to use to keep the length of the hull the same. So what's going to happen is it's going to act correctly when you turn on lock length. That's really important when you start deleting points. You definitely want to lock length before you trim off this hair by deleting points. Alright, obviously this is already pretty straight and can't really smooth anything that's straight, so let's start with curl. Now you have to be careful with this curl because too much and it will start twisting around. So let's just hit curl, and this is the frequency that you can adjust to get some different shapes. So there we go. So let's look at current position. And that's the start. And you can see there how it unwound. Okay. Now once you have a curl in there, you can straighten. So we'll just say straighten to 1, straighten curves, and that straightens it back out. Now you have to be careful with these, and I've noticed this happen. Look at how that curve is coming out of the follicle. See how it's got a bend to it, an angle? That's one thing you have to be careful of when you're using these tools, that it can shift the tangency of that curve. Alright, the next one we have is bend, and this is similar to a bend deformer. Let me just reset this. So I can add so much bend. See how it curled that? Okay, and if I wanted a twist, I can put a little twist within this. Now, Smooth will smooth out. See how I may have a rough curve? Let me go to smooth here, and we'll just set a smooth factor of 4, and that just smooths out the curve. Now the last option is the scale curvature. Now this one works in kind of a weird way. If you have a +1 scale factor, it will continue curving this around. So see how it continued curving that? Let me undo it. Actually, I may have told you that wrong. No, that's right. So if I set this to a scale factor of 0, it goes in the opposite direction. It unwinds it. So set it above 1, and I need to add a bend real quick. See how it keeps curling it? Set it below a 1, and it will start to straighten out that curve. Now that curvature max is controlling how much of that it removes. So there's a less amount. We'll add some in. And you notice if I crank up this max curvature, see how it reacts like that? And that way I can go in and shape these curves. So let me go to my start position. There it is. Okay. Now why is it going to that shape? Well, let's take this curve and we'll set that curve as the rest position from current. Okay, you see it's still got a little bit of a bend, it's still trying to hold its shape. And just from a previous lesson, remember, go in there and adjust the stiffness, and that'll really start cranking that up a little bit. In the next lesson, we're going to look at creating some constraints, and that'll help you understand how you can hold hair in a certain position, as well as how you can make your hair tear away from constraints. It's a lot of fun. Let me show you that next. Within the hair system, except the collide constraint. We're going to make that a whole separate section of the tutorials. What we're going to look at are things like rubber band, stick, the transform constraints, lots of great, the hair to hair and the hair bunch constraints. Let me show you how to use these. Alright, we're going to go ahead and open a file here, and I have one called hair constraints. And this file is real simple. It's just a plane, and it's got some hair curves coming off. If I was to play this back, they're really not going to do anything, because let me add my interactive playback to my shelf here. If I move this, you'll see that they are interactive and moving accordingly. Okay, so what we do is take a handful of these curves, like these, and we'll start to explore the different constraints that you have. So I'm just going to tear this off, put it over here. And we'll start off with the transform, because that's the easiest to learn. Now you click once, and notice what happens. Let me kind of deconstruct this for you. You have these little blue lines, which shows you where this constraint is connected to, and it snaps to each of those points that we have. So obviously the more you have, the more different places you'll be able to snap to, hair points. Okay. And the way that this works, let me turn on interactive playback, is if I move this constraint, it moves all the hair. Okay. If I scale, I can drag them in, spread them apart. I can even rotate. So it's literally a transform constraint, just like what the name says. And that just makes easy work. Let me just turn this back on. Easy work of moving those curves around or getting them into position. Now there is one attribute that I want to show you, and that's this right here called the glue strength. And what you can do is make attributes, or set an attribute that says, okay, this constraint has a glue strength of 1, which pretty much means when I play this back, you will always stay with me, no matter what. See how it even stretches? Now watch what happens if I set this glue strength down to like 0.2 and I play this back. See what happened? I pulled the constraint away from my curves because of this number. So I'm going to rewind this. I'm going to increase my glue strength to like 0.5. Okay, we'll play back, interactive playback. Okay, I've got these moving, but watch what happens if I pull really fast. See how I just pulled that right off? So your characters can do this. So maybe, you know, part of their a rope or something gets caught onto them, and as they struggle, and then they can pull away and it will let go of the rope. So you can do things like that with this transform constraint. Alright, let me go ahead and delete that. Next, let's talk about a few of these other constraints. Something like the rubber band. Now the rubber band is a little bit different. It's not like the similar constraints that you have from the dynamics menu set. But what the rubber band does is see how those blue lines right there? It will flex those blue lines, right? The blue lines will come and get tighter. They can move in closer. So we can pull them together, pull them apart. Now, the rubber band constraint and the stick constraint are very similar. And what I'll do is over here on these curves, I'll add a stick constraint. Now what's different is, see these blue dotted lines? That blue dotted line? It's going to keep that length, right? And all it's going to do is allow this to spin around our constraint. Let me show you. So as I move this back and forth, see how it keeps all those straight? Move this back and forth. And you can see here it gets ready to flip, and then it just flips over. Okay? You don't have that problem with this, or you don't have that attribute with this. See how it pulls it forward? It pulls it back. It doesn't look at this as being a solid object, where this one, it almost treats it like that is a hinge, and it's like a hinge constraint. See how it pulls it over? Pulls them tight. There you can see how I'm pulling them towards me. So if you need some type of a hinge type constraint, that's a really good constraint to use. Let me just stop this for a second here. Alright, so those are the two main, let me just play this and rewind it. There we go. Those are the three main. These two are similar, and transform obviously is a very simple constraint. Now the hair to hair, these are a little bit different than some of these others. These you could equate to something in the dynamics menu set, but the hair to hair is a little bit different. And what's different about this constraint is it's going to treat all of these hairs that I've constrained as one set of hairs. So, oops, let me play back my interactive playback. So let me stop this. Let me dump that and add them again here. It's not playing back. Let's see. If I move these around. Okay, see how it acts like these are connected? All these are connected together. And it's almost like there's a piece of string or a barrette holding all these together. So let me make some modifications on my object here. Set that stiffness to 1. Glue strength to 1. Okay, let's play this back. Interactive playback here. And you can see how these are all treated as one. Okay, and this is all connected to this transform node, or this locator that has really no effect on this group of hairs. Now, on the other side, I'm going to take this group of hairs and I'll do hair bunch. Now what this will do is a very similar hair-to-hair constraint, but allow it to do some collisions, allow it to do they'll rub up against each other and make some a little more interesting collisions here. Let's just put this on. You can see how these react much differently. Than this set, that's the hair to hair. So in some of our future projects, I'm going to show you how to use some of these and to turn them on and off to create, different types of simulations. Let me just dump these real fast. Highlight them and delete. And if you wanted to, we'll just make a constraint. Oops. Make a transformer constraint. So, and if you wanted to, we can animate that. Let me undo here real quick. There we go. So what we'll do is we'll set some keyframes. Set one up here. Okay, we'll go back up a little bit. And then what I'll do is I'll turn that on and off. So here my distance will set the stiffness to 0. Let's just see what we get here. And you see how nothing is happening? So let me set the stiffness to 1. Alright, so we can animate this. We go to this keyframe here, and I'll just set a stiffness of 0. We'll key this. We'll go back 1 frame, and this will be a stiffness of 1, and we'll key that. So now let's rewind this and play this back. So you see here we pull this up, and then we let them go. Right, so that's how you can turn on and off your constraints. Just animate that stiffness coming on and off, and that will then. So if I play this back, see how it's still reacting, no problem. Good. See how those are still bound together. So that's just an easy way of making animated curtains or objects, and later on I'll show you some different examples of how to use a constraint like this. Now in the next lesson I'm going to talk about this collide sphere and collide cube very briefly, and then later on when we use hair on our actual model and we give her hair, we'll use these guys here to make our collision objects just so they're lighter in geometry. Objects that have been tucked away in there. I wish they would have had their own menu for collisions, then group them all together. But these collision objects are very different from the standard set of collision objects. Let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and just open a quick file here, and it's the hair collide file. And it's just some hair tubes or some hair curves sticking out from a flattened torus. Alright. So what we'll do is we'll create a sphere. Under the constraints menu, you actually have 2 collision objects that have been tucked away in there. I wish they would have had their own menu for collisions, then group them all together. But these collision objects are very different from the standard set of collision objects. Let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and just open a quick file here, and it's the hair collide file. And it's just some hair tubes or some hair curves sticking out from a flattened torus. Alright. So what we'll do is we'll create a sphere. Under the constraints menu, you actually have 2 collision objects that have been tucked away in there. I wish they would have had their own menu for collisions that group them all together. But these collision objects are very different from the standard set of collision objects. Let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and just open a quick file here, and it's the hair collide file. And it's just some hair tubes, or some hair curves sticking from the, sticking out from a flattened torus. Alright. So what we'll do is we'll create a sphere. And I'm just going to move it down and out of the way. Okay, obviously we know it's bigger than this set of curves, so we'll just make it a little bit bigger. And we'll select the curve, select the object, and we'll go to Hair, Make Collide. So now when I turn on my interactive playback, I move through here, you notice I have just some basic collisions, but look what happens. Sometimes it collides, sometimes it doesn't. So like I'm colliding right now, but it's not acting like it is. Well, there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, on our sphere here, we have what's called a geoconnector. And we can adjust this amount to maybe something like 800. Now let's play this back. And you see a little bit better, and we have to keep increasing this number until we get something just ridiculous. Well, let me throw this away. Instead, let me use a collide sphere. Okay, so we'll select these hairs, collide sphere. So now let's play back this interactive playback. Rewind real quick. And let me just move this through. And you notice how, first of all, instantly it's much better. Well, this is a system that's already been predefined within Maya, this collision sphere. Right? And it's kind of like an implicit sphere that you can make from the Mel command line. There it is. Much more accurate. So here's what a lot of artists are doing. They will take this object, put it around a standard sphere. Something like that, but let this object do all the work. So let me parent this, and now when I play this back, so I get the illusion of a really good deformation, but when I hit render, I'm not going to see that outer sphere. I'm only going to see this inside one, and you can get it positioned just right. That's what a lot of artists do. Now, these are very similar to just stand-in objects that you can make with rigid body simulations, which is what a lot of artists do, and that's what I do. So let's just make this collide cube, and you'll see that this will be just a standard cube. Oops. There we go. So if you have hard objects that you need to move like that, well, there you go. Now, this also has a few options like stiffness and glue strength, so maybe that's why they bundled them inside of the constraints, but I would have preferred to have seen them, these collision objects, bundled up with this make collide and just keep them all neat together. Okay, in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at how you can change your selection to different things, as well as start to look at ways to optimize our hair. Alright, we're going to now take a look at how to take curves and turn them into dynamic curves. And then we're going to turn that into a little simulation so it looks like our cube is mashing into a surface, much like a trampoline or something like that. Okay, first before we get started on a scene file, let me just go to my side view and let me just draw a couple of quick curves here. So I'll just grab my CV curve tool and snap it along here. Hit enter. And then all I'm going to do is with that curve selected, go to Hair, Make Selected Curves Dynamic. Okay, now if you look what happens, you will have a new output curve, which is right here. And it's right on top of the other curve. So let me play this back and you can see how it dips down. Okay, so there is our curve follicle, the original curve, and then here is the dynamic output curve. So if you wanted to, you could hide that. Just get it out of the way so then all you see is this dynamic curve. Well, there's lots of attributes that you can adjust for this. For example, we can go in to the dynamics section and increase gravity. So we can reduce the drag. So as we move it around, we can have all kinds of different effects happen. There's also the opportunity to pin and unpin certain areas. So if you select the little follicle and go to the follicle shape node, you will notice here that it says point lock both ends. Let me play this back and you see it just droops. If I change this to base, now the tip is going to be released. Okay, and that's like your standard hair system. I can go to the other side, like that, and then I can also release both ends. I'm sorry, no attach, and that way it'll just drop the curve until it reacts with something else. So you can set those to be whatever you need, and you can have that override any of these settings that you want per follicle, which is really cool. Well, let me show you a little file here that we're going to work on, and it's called hair curves. Okay, and what I'd like to do is have this object hit this ground, but I want this to be kind of soft, so I want it to kind of mash in and flex and act like it's kind of like a trampoline. So the first thing we'll need to do is take this little guy and add some gravity to it. Okay, and then it just falls. Well, if I have it just take this object and make this a passive rigid body, it's not going to react. And I'm going to scale this up just a bit. Okay. But I want this to be soft, so what I'll do is, let me undo our passive rigid body here that we did. Make sure that's good. And I'll just go to my top view here. I need to go in there and select some isoforms. So I'm just going to drag a little box down all of these isoforms. Okay, that you see here. And I'm going to go to my modeling, edit curves, detach surface curves, and we'll just move those up in the air. Okay, so now my surface I can throw away. No longer need those. So what I'll do now is take all of these curves and loft a new surface. Actually, before I do that, I want to turn them into dynamic curves. So we'll just jump over here to Dynamics, Hair, Make Selected Curves Dynamic. There we go. Now before you loft this, we want to make sure we get the right curves. So we'll take these output curves and loft those together. Surfaces loft. Okay, so there's the surface that we've made. Now, the surface itself, we can make that, back in Dynamics, we can make that a passive rigid body. We'll play this. And that's not quite the look we're after, because it's happening after the fact. So let's take these curves. Actually, we could probably go just to the hair system. And let's increase, under Dynamics, the stiffness. Okay. And I'm also going to increase the drag a little bit. And decrease the gravity a bit. There we go. So that's getting closer to a flat object. Now, all we have left to do is introduce into our system a collision object. So I'll make a create constraint collision, we'll choose sphere, just so we can get a smoother object here. Let me select one of my curves, my system. Okay. Let's see. Select our curves. Try this one more time. There we go. Okay. And I'm just going to do a point constraint onto this little guy. So they'll go into our animation menu set. We'll do a point constraint. So now let's play this back. And we get a very similar result to if it was a soft object. Now, obviously a lot of this is going to be factored in on, you know, how this object is presented. I don't want it to drop off. Let's give it more rotation here. But you get the idea. And you can use that to make all kinds of really cool simulations. Maybe objects thrown into water or onto a bed, and you want the bed to kind of mash in. You could do a fake simulation like this and make that work the way you want it to work. Let's just scale this up a little bit. There we go. So, something cool like that. And you can see we've got a volume that's been depressed into the system. And again, you can run the soft body or the passive simulation on this cube, turn off the rendering, but make a bigger cube so it looks like it goes into the surface. That's very easy to do also. So there you go, and that's how you can turn regular curves into passive curves, or I'm sorry, into dynamic curves or into hairs. And from there, we'll show you some other examples of this later on in our projects. Have to cache these simulations if you're going to go out to a render farm. We use Mustard here at the office and we've been very happy with the way it works, but you have to create a cache. The reason being, one machine may see frames 1 through 10 and render them no problem and simulate it as it goes, but when the next machine grabs 11 through 20, it's not going to know where the hair was on frame 10. So it starts the simulation over again, and you're going to end up with really, really poor results. Let me show you what I mean by that. Alright, we'll go ahead and open a file here called hairbase, and let's take a look at this. Turn off my grid real quick. Alright, we'll play this back. Now this does not have a cache. So there it is, playing back 80 frames, or 90 frames. So I'll go back to the beginning, no problem. I can scrub forward, but watch what happens when I scrub backwards. Nothing. It doesn't know where it is and where it's going because it has to simulate forward. So what we're going to do is tell the system, okay, why don't you go ahead and make a cache. Figure out where you are on every single frame and write that to a file. So we'll just go to this option box here. Now you can choose the render globals, which that's usually a pretty safe bet because in your render globals you can define how many frames you want to render. You want to be careful of the time slider because as you can see earlier I had like 10,000 frames, so that's not a good option. But I will say the start and end. So we'll just set this to 80. And you can oversample or undersample, and this is your multiplier. So if you want to take more than one sample per frame, you can increase that to get something more accurate. Or if you have a lot of hair, you might want to undersample, just get a close approximation. So I'll hit create, and oops, gotta select my hair first. And it goes pretty quick. It's going to go through and figure out where it is on every frame. And now I can scrub back and forth. I'm set. I'm ready to go. Now you can do a couple of things. What you can do is, let's say we modify this a little bit. I added some rotation right here. So up to here it looks good, but then my object rotates and it doesn't know how to solve that. So I can go to this frame 39 and say append to my cache. And I'll say, okay, I want you to take from the current time to the time slider end, or I can say start and end and give it some times. So we'll just say, let me select my hair. And it doesn't have to recache, so if you did have 10,000 frames, it won't have to redo the first 8,000 just because you added a change to it. You can see here now they're going down to up. Now let's say you want to make some major modifications. You're going to have to just delete the cache. And you will have to delete it before you can make a new one. So now again, that doesn't work. So let's make our cache again. There we go. Scrub this. No problem. And then the last one is truncate. If you want to throw away from frame 49 on, this stuff will still work, but from here it won't. So that's what that does. Alright, we'll go ahead and delete this cache. Now, one thing that you're going to see, the very last option in our menus is delete entire hair system. Why is that option there? Well, the hair system is made up of a lot of stuff. Namely, if I open up the outliner, you'll see here that I've got a hair system, hair follicle. So if you just grab this and throw it away, you haven't thrown away everything. So they made it very easy for you. You can just grab any part of it and just go to hair, delete entire system, and it will go in there and remove all the nodes for that system. So it just makes it a lot easier when you're working with lots of objects, lots of creatures, and you just want to get hair taken off of one object so you can add it again, or whatever your situation may be. Alright, next we're going to look at some of the attributes that are in the default hair system and go through each of those and show you what they do. Now we're going to take a look at the hair system itself and some of the attributes that are tucked away inside of it. Alright, let me open up my base hair file here. And on this, I'm going to take a look at some of the attributes that we have for the hair system shape node. Now, first of all, you're going to notice that we have a display quality. As I drag this down, 100% would be, every hair displayed. As I drag this down, I can lower down the number of hairs displayed. And what's good about that is, instead of having to view every one of these hairs, which can slow down the simulation process, I can drop that down a little bit, and you'll see that the hairs will simulate a little bit faster than if I had all the hairs on. And this is particularly true when you have a lot of paint effects and very high quality paint effects on your system, or on your hair system. Alright, then you have the clump and hair shape attributes. Now this is saying that per group or clump that you see here, you have one coming out of here, one curve, and we have 10 hairs per clump. So as I increase this number, you can see I can increase the density. However, it's going to run a little bit slower. Right? So I can lower down this number, because that's just the display quality, but still have this cranked up high, and that's going to run a lot faster. So it's just totally up to you on what your end goal is going to be and how fast your system is to work. I'll just drop this back down. Again, you can have one hair per clump, so if you're going to do paint effects and you want to know exactly where they're placed, that's really useful. The 10-ish number is by default. Alright, subsegments. The subsegments calculate how well the smoothing happens between the points. So let's play this back. Okay, you can see right here. Now I'll take that up to 3. And you can see already how smooth that is. So you're going to need to put some subsegments, and here's what I recommend. Use these presets. Go up here and hit Save Hair System Preset and store. Once you have all these settings done, store them away. That's the best way to reuse them and not waste your time having to reset lots of stuff. Alright, now you've got thinning. Thinning controls these shorter hairs. So as I increase this, you'll notice it looks like they're getting eaten away, but they're not. You're just increasing some short hairs. This is very similar to when you go to a hairdresser or a barber and you get your hair thinned. They just come in and they cut some hairs down here so it thins it out. the ends are not so blocky this one. Alright, then you've got just your standard clump, twist, your bend, and your width of the clump and width of the hair. You're going to need to adjust some of these to get good coverage over your head or sphere or whatever you got going here. So twisting, we'll just twist each one of those clumps. So pretty standard. This bend, follow, that right there really controls how much rotation is happening around this axis of each clump. So let me just turn that down, show you how that plays, and then we'll turn it back up. And you can definitely see a difference in the way that works and the way that's tied down like that. Okay, that's with your bend, follow. Now, two last ones before we move on. You've got the clump width and the hair width. Now these are overrides. These are like the global setups because you also have them per clump down here. So on a global setting, you can adjust the width here, and that's how you get some extra volume. Okay, so if we take a look at this, see how our volume increased just by increasing this clump width. If I take it down, then each clump is very tight. So we'll have density here. Let me render this real quick. Okay. You're going to see density. But here, I'll pull back a little bit so you can see. See, we have the hairs coming out from all over. Now, you also have the ability to adjust the hair width, and that's the individual width of each hair. So let me render this now after turning it up. And you can see each hair is thicker. Now be careful with this number. The reason I say be careful is it depends on how far away your character is going to be from the set. Because these hairs look really thick. Right? Almost too thick. Crank that down a little bit. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. But again, it totally depends on the size of your character. If you want very fine hair, you might want to take that down really low. Something very fine like that. Alright, in the next lesson, I'm going to go over the clump scale widgets here that we have for all the clumps in the hair widths. We'll play with those and show you how they work. Now we're going to take a look at the hair system itself and some of the attributes that are tucked away inside of it. Alright, let me open up my base hair file here. And on this, I'm going to take a look at some of the attributes that we have for the hair system shape node. Now, first of all, you're going to notice that we have a display quality. As I drag this down, 100% would be, every hair displayed. As I drag this down, I can lower down the number of hairs displayed. And what's good about that is instead of having to view every one of these hairs, which can slow down the simulation process, I can drop that down a little bit, and you'll see that the hairs will simulate a little bit faster than if I had all the hairs on. And this is particularly true when you have a lot of paint effects and very high quality paint effects on your system, or on your hair system. Alright, then you have the clump and hair shape attributes. Now this is saying that per group or clump that you see here, we have one coming out of here, one curve, and we have 10 hairs per clump. So as I increase this number, you can see I can increase the density. However, it's going to run a little bit slower. Okay. So I can lower down this number. That's just the display quality. Still have this cranked up high. And that's going to run a lot faster. So it's just totally up to you on what your end goal is going to be and how fast your system is to work. I'll just drop this back down. Again, you can have one hair per clump. So if you're going to do paint effects and you want to know exactly where they're placed, That's really useful. The 10-ish number is by default. Alright, subsegments. The subsegments calculate how well the smoothing happens between the points. So let's play this back. Okay, you can see right here. Now take that up to 3. You can see already how smooth that is. So you're going to need to put some subsegments. And here's what I recommend. Use these presets. Go up here and hit Save Hair System Preset and store. Once you have all these settings done, store them away. That's the best way to reuse them and not waste your time having to reset lots of stuff. Alright, now you've got thinning. Thinning controls these shorter hairs. So as I increase this, you'll notice it looks like they're getting eaten away, but they're not. You're just increasing some short hairs. This is very similar to when you go to a hairdresser or a barber and you get your hair thinned. They just come in and they cut some hairs down here so it thins it out. The ends are not so blocky this way. Alright, then you've got just your standard clump twist, your bend, and your width of the clump and width of the hair. You're going to need to adjust some of these to get good coverage over your head or sphere or whatever you got going here. So twisting, we'll just twist each one of those clumps. So pretty standard. This bend, follow, that right there really controls how much rotation is happening around this axis of each clump. So let me just turn that down, show you how that plays, and then we'll turn it back up. And you can definitely see a difference in the way that works and the way that's tied down like that. Okay, that's with your bend, follow. Now, two last ones before we move on. You've got the clump width and the hair width. Now these are overrides. These are like the global setups because you also have them per clump down here. So on a global setting, you can adjust the width here, and that's how you get some extra volume. Okay, so if we take a look at this, see how our volume increased just by increasing this clump width. If I take it down, then each clump is very tight. So we'll have density here. Let me render this real quick. Okay, you're going to see density. But here, pull back a little bit so you can see. See, we have the hairs coming out from all over. Now, you also have the ability to adjust the hair width, and that's the individual width of each hair. So let me render this now after turning it up. And you can see each hair is thicker. Now be careful with this number. The reason I say be careful is it depends on how far away your character is going to be from the set. Because these hairs look really thick. Right, almost too thick. Crank that down a little bit. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. But again, it totally depends on the size of your character. If you want very fine hair, you might want to take that down really low. Just something very fine like that. Alright, in the next lesson, I'm going to go over the clump scale widgets here that we have for all the clumps and the hair widths. We'll play with those and show you how they work.